Microsoft didn't see it coming, not like this. For years, the idea of a major Western government fully pivoting away from Windows and toward Linux had floated around like a theoretical possibility, something debated in tech forums and policy papers but rarely executed at scale. Yet when France made its move, it wasn't cautious or symbolic. It was decisive, strategic, and most importantly, public. The announcement rippled across the global tech landscape with a clarity that left no room for ambiguity. A major digital power was choosing independence over convenience, control over familiarity, and long-term sovereignty over short-term comfort. At first, the headlines framed it as a cost-saving measure. That's how transitions like this are usually explained, reducing licensing fees, reallocating budgets, making taxpayer money go further. But as more details surfaced, it became clear that cost was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. France wasn't just replacing software, it was redefining its relationship with technology itself. The shift to Linux represented a philosophical stance, a declaration that critical infrastructure should not depend on proprietary systems controlled by foreign corporations. Inside Microsoft, the reaction was immediate but not publicly visible. Internally, executives scrambled to assess the implications. France wasn't just any customer, it represented a model, an influential, technologically advanced nation whose decisions could inspire others. If France could successfully transition government systems to Linux, what would stop Germany, Spain, or even parts of the European Union from following suit? At first, Microsoft's external response was measured. Carefully worded statements emphasized their commitment to supporting governments worldwide, highlighting the flexibility and security of their ecosystem. They pointed to Azure, to hybrid cloud solutions, to their growing embrace of open-source tools. But beneath that calm surface was a deeper concern. The rules of the game were changing, and the shift wasn't in Microsoft's favor. France's transition didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of planning, experimentation, and gradual implementation. Government agencies had already begun adopting open-source alternatives in isolated environments. Linux-based systems were tested in education, public administration, and even defense sectors. By the time the official announcement came, much of the groundwork had already been laid. What made the move particularly significant was the narrative behind it. French officials didn't just talk about software, they talked about sovereignty. Digital sovereignty became the central theme, a concept that resonated deeply in an era where data had become as valuable as oil. By adopting Linux, France positioned itself as a nation reclaiming control over its digital infrastructure, reducing reliance on external vendors and ensuring that its data remained within its own jurisdiction. This wasn't just a technical decision, it was geopolitical. Microsoft understood that immediately. The company had spent decades building not just products, but ecosystems, interconnected services that made switching away difficult. Windows wasn't just an operating system, it was a gateway to Office, to Azure, to enterprise management tools, to a vast network of dependencies that kept customers within the Microsoft orbit. France's move threatened to disrupt that entire model. Inside Microsoft's strategy meetings, the questions became sharper. Was this an isolated case or the beginning of a broader trend? How could they retain relevance in a world increasingly interested in open-source solutions? And perhaps most importantly, how could they respond without appearing defensive or out of touch? One of Microsoft's biggest strengths had always been its ability to adapt. The company that once viewed Linux as a competitor had, over the years, integrated it into its own ecosystem. Azure supported Linux extensively. Developers using Microsoft tools could work seamlessly with open-source frameworks. In many ways, Microsoft had already begun transforming itself into a company that thrived alongside Linux rather than against it. But France's decision forced Microsoft to confront a different reality. Coexistence wasn't enough if customers began to see proprietary systems as unnecessary. As the news spread, reactions across the tech world were mixed. Open-source advocates celebrated it as a victory, a validation of years of effort promoting alternatives to proprietary software. Critics, however, raised practical concerns. Could Linux truly replace Windows in large-scale government operations without disrupting productivity? Would employees adapt quickly enough? What about compatibility with existing systems? France addressed these concerns with confidence. Training programs were rolled out. Custom Linux distributions tailored to government needs were developed. Partnerships with local tech companies ensured support and maintenance remained within the country. This wasn't a rushed migration, it was a carefully orchestrated transformation. For Microsoft, the challenge wasn't just technical, it was psychological. For decades, Windows had been the default. It was what people knew, what they trusted, what they were trained to use. France's decision challenged that default, proving that alternatives weren't just viable, they were implementable at scale. The ripple effects began to to appear almost immediately. Other governments started re-evaluating their own systems. Discussions that had once been theoretical became practical. Pilot programs were launched, committees were formed. The idea of switching to Linux was no longer fringe, it was mainstream. Microsoft's response evolved. Instead of pushing back directly against Linux, the company leaned further into its hybrid approach. They emphasized interoperability, showcasing how their tools could work seamlessly in mixed environments. Azure became a central pillar of this strategy, positioned not as a competitor to open source solutions, but as a platform that could host and enhance them. At the same time, Microsoft doubled down on value. They highlighted the productivity benefits of their software, the integration between their services, the support structures that came with their ecosystem. The message was clear. While alternatives existed, Microsoft offered a level of convenience and reliability that was difficult to replicate. But the narrative had shifted. It was no longer just about features and functionality. It was about control. France's move had tapped into a broader concern shared by many nations: dependence on foreign technology providers. In a world where data breaches, surveillance concerns, and geopolitical tensions were increasingly common, the idea of digital independence carried significant weight. Microsoft found itself navigating a delicate balance. On one hand, it needed to defend its position as a trusted partner. On the other, it had to acknowledge the legitimacy of these concerns without undermining its own business model. The company's messaging became more nuanced. They emphasized transparency, security, and compliance. They highlighted their efforts to align with regional regulations, their investments in local data centers, their commitment to protecting user privacy. It was a strategic shift from being seen as a global provider to being perceived as a local partner. Meanwhile, inside France, the transition continued to unfold. Early reports indicated challenges as expected. Some systems required adjustments, certain workflows needed rethinking, but overall the transition was progressing, and more importantly, it was progressing publicly. Success stories were shared, agencies reported increased control over their systems, costs began to stabilize, local tech ecosystems benefited from increased demand for Linux expertise. The narrative wasn't just about switching, it was about building something new. For Microsoft, this was perhaps the most concerning aspect. France wasn't just moving away, it was creating an alternative ecosystem that could sustain itself. As months passed, the global conversation intensified. Analysts debated whether this marked the beginning of a broader shift in enterprise computing. Some argued that proprietary systems would always have a place due to their ease of use and integrated features. Others believed that open source solutions would continue to gain ground, driven by cost, flexibility, and the growing importance of digital sovereignty. Microsoft's actions suggested they were preparing for both scenarios. They continued investing in their core products while simultaneously expanding their support for open-source technologies. It was a dual strategy, protecting their existing base while positioning themselves for a future where exclusivity mattered less. The company also focused heavily on developers. By ensuring that their tools remained indispensable to the development community, Microsoft aimed to maintain influence regardless of the underlying operating system. Visual Studio Code, GitHub, and other platforms became key components of this approach, bridging the gap between proprietary and open-source worlds. France's decision, however, remained a constant reference point. It was cited in discussions, analyzed in reports, and debated in policy circles. It had become more than a national initiative. It was a symbol of what was possible. For Microsoft, the lesson was clear. The future of technology wasn't just about innovation. It was about trust, control, and alignment with broader societal values. The story didn't end with France. It evolved. Other countries watched closely, learning from both the successes and challenges of the transition. Some moved quickly, launching their own initiatives. Others took a more cautious approach, conducting studies and pilot programs. Microsoft remained at the center of this evolving landscape, adapting, responding, and, in many ways, transforming. The company that once dominated through control was now navigating a world that increasingly valued openness. And perhaps that was the most significant outcome of all. France's decision didn't just challenge Microsoft, it challenged the entire industry to rethink its assumptions. In the end, Microsoft's reaction wasn't defined by a single statement or strategy. It was defined by a series of adjustments, each reflecting a deeper understanding of the changing dynamics. The company didn't collapse under the pressure, nor did it dismiss the shift. Instead, it adapted as it had done many times before. But this time, the stakes were different. This wasn't just about competing products, it was about competing philosophies. And in that competition, the outcome was far from certain. The uncertainty is what lingered the longest. Even as Microsoft adjusted its messaging and refined its strategy, there was no immediate way to measure the full impact of France's decision. Unlike a product launch or a quarterly earnings report, this shift would play out over years, maybe even decades. It wasn't a moment, it was a trajectory. Inside Microsoft, teams began modeling different futures. In one scenario, France remained an outlier. an ambitious but isolated case that other governments observed but ultimately chose not to replicate. In another, far more disruptive scenario, France became a catalyst, triggering a wave of similar transitions across Europe and beyond. The difference between those two outcomes wasn't just significant, it was existential. Because if the second scenario unfolded, it wouldn't just mean losing customers, it would mean losing influence. For decades, Microsoft's influence extended far beyond software. It shaped how organizations operated, how employees collaborated, how data flowed, and how digital infrastructure was built. Windows wasn't just a tool, it was a foundation. Office wasn't just productivity software, it was a standard. These weren't just products, they were defaults embedded into the global workflow. France's move challenged the idea of defaults, and once defaults are questioned, they rarely return unchanged. What made the situation even more complex was the generational shift already underway in the tech world. Younger developers, system administrators, and IT professionals were increasingly comfortable with Linux and open-source tools. For them, switching wasn't a disruption, it was often a preference. Many had grown up using flexible, modular systems rather than monolithic platforms. Microsoft had already recognized this trend years earlier, which is why it invested heavily in platforms that appealed to developers regardless of operating system. But France's decision accelerated the relevance of that investment. It wasn't just about attracting developers anymore, it was about remaining relevant in environments where Windows might not be the primary operating system. In response, Microsoft leaned further into one of its most strategic assets, the cloud. Azure became more than just a service, it became a bridge. It allowed Microsoft to maintain a presence even in ecosystems that didn't rely on Windows. Governments or organizations could adopt Linux on the desktop while still using Azure for infrastructure, storage, and advanced services like AI and analytics. This hybrid positioning gave Microsoft a way to adapt without conceding entirely, but even that strategy had limits. If the philosophy driving France's decision, digital sovereignty, continued to gain traction, cloud services themselves could come under scrutiny. After all, sovereignty wasn't just about operating systems, it was about data, control, and jurisdiction. Microsoft anticipated this. The company began emphasizing localized cloud solutions, partnerships with regional providers, and compliance with national regulations. Data residency became a key talking point. The message was subtle but intentional. You don't have to abandon Microsoft to achieve sovereignty. You can achieve it with Microsoft. Whether that message would resonate remained uncertain. Meanwhile, France continued refining its approach. One of the most interesting developments was how it began contributing back to the open source community. Instead of simply using Linux, French institutions started participating in its evolution, funding projects, contributing code, and collaborating with developers worldwide. This was a fundamental difference from the proprietary model. In the Microsoft ecosystem, innovation flowed from the company to the user. In the open source world, innovation was distributed. Users weren't just consumers, they were contributors. That shift had long-term implications. It meant that France wasn't just reducing dependency, it was building capability, and capability is harder to replace than software. As this dynamic became more visible, it sparked a broader conversation about the future of technology governance. Should critical systems be controlled by private corporations, even highly trusted ones? Or should they be built on open foundations that any nation could inspect, modify, and secure independently? Microsoft found itself in an unusual position. It wasn't being criticized for failure or vulnerability, it was being questioned because of its success. Its dominance had made it indispensable, and that indispensability had become a point of concern. The company's response, again, was adaptation. It continued opening up parts of its ecosystem, releasing tools as open source and supporting cross-platform compatibility. The goal wasn't to abandon its business model, but to soften its edges, to make participation in the Microsoft ecosystem feel less like dependency and more like choice. At the same time, Microsoft quietly strengthened areas where it still held a clear advantage. Enterprise support, security infrastructure, and integrated productivity tools remained key differentiators. While Linux offered flexibility and control, Microsoft offered cohesion and convenience. For many organizations, that trade-off still mattered, but France's decision had introduced a new variable into that equation: values. Suddenly, decisions about technology weren't just based on efficiency or cost. They were influenced by political, ethical, and strategic considerations. Governments weren't just asking what works best, they were asking what aligns best with our long-term interests. That shift made the landscape more complex, but also more unpredictable. Back within Microsoft, there was a growing recognition that the company couldn't rely solely on its legacy strengths. The future would require a different kind of leadership, one that balanced innovation with trust, global reach with local sensitivity, and proprietary advantages with open collaboration. This realization wasn't dramatic or public. It didn't come in the form of a single announcement or a sweeping overhaul. It emerged gradually, reflected in product decisions, partnerships, and messaging. And yet it marked a significant evolution, because for the first time in a long time, Microsoft wasn't setting the direction of the industry, it was responding to it. France, on the other hand, had positioned itself as a leader in a different sense, not by dominating the market, but by redefining its relationship with it. Its move to Linux wasn't about replacing one system with another. It was about reshaping the underlying assumptions of digital infrastructure. Of course, the story remained unfinished. There were still challenges to overcome. Migration at scale is never seamless. There were still critics who questioned whether the benefits would outweigh the disruptions. There were still unknowns about how the system would evolve over time. But one thing was no longer in doubt. The shift had happened. And once a shift like that occurs, it becomes part of the landscape. It influences decisions, shapes expectations, and creates new possibilities. For Microsoft, the challenge was no longer to prevent that shift, it was to navigate it. And in doing so, the company found itself returning to a familiar principle, one that had guided it through previous transformations. Survival in the tech industry doesn't come from resisting change. It comes from adapting to it faster than anyone else. Whether that would be enough this time remained to be seen. Because this wasn't just another technological transition, it was a redefinition of power in the digital age.